program, which is a multi-stakeholder project to generate the proof that organic residuals deserve to be in mine rehabilitation programs. And we were very fortunate, for those of you who weren't at our National Compost Conference this year in Halifax, to have Bryan agree to do this presentation for us. So don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you very much, Bryan. It's great that you're here.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. This is the first time I've done a webinar, and I've had a difficult morning because my computer crashed first thing this morning, so I struggled to put a few more slides in and get that to you on time today. But I have a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them as best I can in the time, and if I need to, I'll gloss over some of them. But I guess my goals for today are basically just to explain a little bit about mining and the environment and how compost or organic residuals can be utilized on tailings reclamation or for tailings reclamation. Give you a little bit of an update on the progress that we've made through this Green Mines, Green Energy program in terms of demonstrating the feasibility of using these materials. And I guess just talk briefly about where we, in terms of NRCan, are trying to go with the work for this kind of work. So I'll just jump in here. So basically I'm just going to, this is a talk is very similar to what was given in Halifax. I've just added more slides to it, but just giving an overview of the mining issues. I'm not sure how familiar people are with mining and tailings and the environmental issues associated with that. Talk a little bit about some of the work we've done with paper mill biosolids. Talk a little bit about the Green Mines, Green Energy initiative, and I'm showing you a fair number of photos on the kind of results we've gotten. And then just as I mentioned, moving forward, biochar is one of the things we're moving forward with and trying to promote carbon in tailings. So getting into it, what are tailings? Tailings are basically the material that's rejected from the mill after the valuable materials have been recovered. So essentially the boulders, I'm hoping you can see my pointer here, the boulders are crushed and ground down. The rock is crushed and ground down. It's a very fine form. They then, typically for base metals anyways, this is not oil sands processes, this is base metals. They will basically float the metals off on air bubbles, which forms a froth that will get skimmed off. The metals are recovered. That accounts typically for about 5% of the rock that they mine. The other 95% gets deposited into the environment or pumped into the environment as a slurry, and those are called tailings. So you can see the tailings coming out here are dark gray color, and basically they are just simply ground rock. There's a few processed chemicals on there, but it's essentially just ground rock. So the problem with those is they have something called, they have metal sulfides. A good example of that is fool's gold, pyrite, and that pyrite will oxidize or rust. So when you have oxygen and water present, it'll form a sulfuric acid and will release metals. And so what you see now is those dark gray tailings have rusted and are now very low pH, as low as around, well, I guess about the lowest I've measured is about 1.7, so typically around 2 to 2.5. This middle picture shows you the unoxidized tailings at the bottom, and then the oxidized or rusted tailings on the top. And that basically shows you how far oxygen penetrates into those tailings. So the original material is down below, the weathered material is on top, and then this last picture shows you an example of the kind of drainage that comes off of these sites. So this will either be as surface flow over the tailings, or as groundwater seepage coming through the dams, and that's the case here. This is a tailings dam, and it's seepage coming out the bottom. Very orange, as you can see, so very high in iron. Again, the pH will be down around 2, which is very acidic, very, very high sulfate, and often will have nickel and copper and other metals associated with that. So it has to be, it's quite hazardous to the environment and has to be treated before it's released to the environment. Just showing you the types of offsite effects. Two principal ones that I deal with are dust. This top photo on the left side is Vale in Coppercliff in Sudbury. Just showing the kind of dust storms that can generate there. That's a very old picture, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. The bottom one on the left side is Goldcorp in Timmins, and that's showing gold tailings. And often gold tailings are associated with arsenic, so you can have arsenic dust flowing off these sites. And then this third photo shows an example of CanmetMINING, which is in Timmins. It was actually Ontario's most polluted site. It's now basically at taxpayer expense. They've spent about $80 million, that's $80 million, cleaning up this site. But what I wanted to show you here is you've got the tailings at the top of the picture, And you see this whole kill here is a seepage kill from groundwater flow from those tailings to the environment and killing all the vegetation in its path. The fortunate thing here, this is a large lake, Kamkosha Lake. The fortunate thing is this is an outflow to the lake, so this seepage was not flowing into the lake, but in fact was being carried downstream away from that lake. This is a very strong cottaging lake and would have been basically killed if this had flowed the other way. But that gives you an idea of the kind of environmental damage that basically pyrite causes in mine tailings. So just some of the growth constraints in mine waste. Particle size and structure, very uniform material. You end up with lots of compaction. There's no organic matter typically in these tailings. Again, I'm talking base metal tailings, not oil sands tailings. Lack of nutrients, lack of soil microbes. There are microbes in there that catalyze this oxidation of the tailings or the pyrite. Very low pH and typically high metal content. Much of that can all be controlled by having organic matter in those tailings. So the organic matter helps build soil structure, gets rid of compaction, provides nutrients, serves as a resource for microbes. So lack of organic matter is a big issue. So I mentioned this photo of Vale. I don't want to just send a message that it's all doom and gloom. This is a before and after, basically. So this is, the top picture is probably, I don't know, I guess late 60s or so. And the bottom picture is that same site, same view, probably about 1998 or so. So there has been a lot of work done to do this, and it's typically been adding lots of lime, lots of fertilizer, re-liming if necessary, because even though you control the existing acidity, the pyrite will still continue to oxidize, and the pH will drop again, so you'll lose the vegetation you have there, so you have to go back and lime or keep liming. So that's typically the way, though, is to lime, fertilize, seed, and plant trees. And they've had some good results with it, but we're trying to look at ways that we can do that better. So just a bit of background. My involvement with this kind of thing started right when I did my master's, and started working with a couple of companies that were interested in working with paper mill biosolids. Specifically, were Rio Algom, Vale, and Goldcorp, and I'm going to show you a few photos of those. Vale, in case you don't recall, is formerly Inco, and Glencore is formerly Falconbridge, two major Canadian mining companies who are no longer Canadian mining companies. We had some discussions a number of years ago with the City of Toronto to talk about using their composted garbage as a reclamation material for mines. So this was initiated back when I was just doing my master's. You may recall, some of you, if you're familiar with anything in Ontario that happened at that time, there was a proposal to dispose of Toronto's garbage in the Adams mine in Kirkland Lake in an old open pit that had been mined out. And a big public outcry over that we don't want Toronto's garbage in the north. And so we were very cognizant of that. It got shut down basically because of the public outcry. So we were looking at how can we pick this up again and look at providing some sound science for tailings work, not for open pit work, but for tailings management on how we can utilize these kind of materials. And at the same time, there was a biodiesel plant proposed for Sudbury, and they were looking for feedstock for that biodiesel plant, and that's when the light bulb sort of went off for me. We've got, for the Vale site, you've got 2,000 hectares within 10 kilometers of their proposed site, and perhaps there's an opportunity for us to grow some feedstock on those tailings for biofuel production. So just stepping back a little bit, the Pronto mine, this was owned by Rio Algom, and this was using paper mill biosolids, so this kind of started the ball rolling for us. The top left photo here, the part where you see where there's very low vegetation are the fine grain tailings, and we're very resistant to company efforts to reclaim it through lime and fertilizer. After about 20 years, that's the result they had. So I was hired actually right out of graduate school to work on that project, and started some discussions with two paper mill companies, and we ended up settling on one of them. So long story short, we applied about 30 or 40 centimeters of paper mill biosolids onto this portion of tailings. You can see that in the top photo on the right-hand side, where that's now been covered. And then you can see about, that took us about 5 years because we were doing this in wintertime only when we could get access on the tailings with heavy equipment. And then in 2009, so about 8 or 9 years later, we've got 20-foot tall trembling aspen trees and birch trees, and it's fully covered. So it was probably the first tailings site in Ontario that a full site reclamation with paper mill biosolids. We got very good vegetation establishment. The mining company estimated, at their own estimate, that we saved them about $2 million over their next best option, which was to quarry all the bedrock surrounding the site and use that as a cover material. And the paper mill company, which was St. Mary's in Sault Ste. Marie, was paying tipping fees to dispose of their material in a municipal landfill. And those tipping fees delivered the material on site for that cost. So the mining companies reimbursed them half of that cost. So they saved on their disposal costs, and the mining companies got a reclamation material quite cheaply. So that started the ball rolling. We then did some trials at Vale and Coppercliff. This is an example of a drainage ditch in their reactive tailings. 1999, you can see some test plots that we did there to see whether we could get anything to grow there, and there's just a very thin layer of biosolids in those materials. You see 2008, it didn't take that long to grow, but this is 9 years later, and you can see we've got very good vegetation. The drainage ditch is right down the middle here. I hope you can see my pointer, but to the left side of the picture is the drainage ditch. So that was another example, and if we looking back the other way, the drainage ditch is right down the center here on the left side, and you can see the kind of vegetation we had that. And that was all done with only about 10 centimeters of, this time, Domtar settling basin biosolids. So, and then we did a study about 5 years after and found no metal uptake into the vegetation, and it's, to this day, is very dense vegetation on there. So, very simple way of, instead of that material being landfilled at Domtar, we applied it on a site like this, and we got very, very good vegetation establishment there with a very thin cover. Based on all of that work, Goldcorp in Timmins did work on the Conneorum mine, and that was done. They actually signed a 5-year agreement with Abitibi Consolidated, paper company in Timmins area, to take all of their paper mill waste for that 5-year period. So again, long story short, that work we did initially led to approvals from MOE for them to try this. While there was lots of engineering work done to stabilize this site, this is a tailings facility. So they rebuilt the dams, moved tailings back into the dams, all kinds of recontouring and erosion control. But the final cover that went on there was paper mill biosolids. So what you see on the right-hand side is vegetation growth in paper mill biosolids. So we're making progress there, and then we wanted to figure out, well, how can we do this on a larger scale? Had some discussions with the City of Toronto again, and this is the kind of conundrum we got into where the city, the organic waste suppliers, for example, the City of Toronto, who at the time were still shipping to Michigan, but we're now looking at stopping that. They would make no commitment to the mines to send the material to the mines until the mining companies would commit on paper to take that material, but the mines wouldn't commit until they got approval from the regulators to say it was okay to put it on the tailings, and the regulators wouldn't give approval until they had some kind of science to say that it was safe to do so and there wouldn't be negative consequences from that. And that's where NRCan kind of came in. We established this Green Mines, Green Energy initiative to try and generate some sound science to show this material can be used in mine sites, and to create demonstration sites where we can bring regulators out there. And we worked through this project, worked with the Ministry of Environment in Ontario, as well as a couple of others which I'll talk about, to actually do that, to show them that work. So basically, the original project was a 3-year demonstration study led by NRCan. Basically, we were trying to advance mine reclamation. Typically, for base metal mines, the reclamation proceeds in terms of trying to establish some sort of a forest that was similar to what was there before. Nothing wrong with that, but basically it's land that's never really used. It's habitat for animals, and again, that's fine, but in some cases, like the Vale site where you've got 2,000 hectares, if you can turn that into something more productive, for example, bioenergy crops, I think that's a very good tool for mining companies to have in their back pocket for that. And so we're also looking to be able to contribute feedstock to that biodiesel plant I talked about. We basically had 4 main target areas, determining what the impact was of the organic residuals on the tailings, quantifying how much biomass we could actually produce. We didn't know whether we could grow these kind of crops on tailings or not. I'm not aware that it's really been done anywhere else. Wanted to look a bit at the economic feasibility, and then because of that whole Adams Mine issue with disposing Toronto's garbage in the open pit and the outcry from that, we were trying to, for NRCan, to play a role in providing information and technical guidance and everything to the public. And we did that through participation in a variety of different types of conferences and that were open to the public. So that's what we were aiming at. These were the primary participants. Glencore is one of our field sites. Vale is one of our field sites. Goldcorp is one of our field sites. Barrick Gold was helping out a lot. They're doing some work in the Dominican Republic and offered some help. We did try to do some work at Highland Valley Copper in British Columbia. We had some test sites in Cape Breton through the Enterprise Cape Breton Corporation, ECBC. We had Domtar, St. Mary's, and Abitibi Consolidated from the forestry side. We had ourselves, NRCan, the Ontario Ministry of Food and Rural Affairs, Ontario Ministry of Environment involved. Laurentian University did most of the field work for us at the field plots in Sudbury and Timmins. So we worked with them on getting everything up and running and doing the trials. Growbark was involved in providing advice and providing a Toronto compost material that's still being used, and I'll talk more about that. City of Greater Sudbury invested some funds into this, which let us go after green municipal funding, which we were able to match with industry contributions, and then Laurentian was able to obtain NSERC and Ontario research funding work. So we, all told, we had raised about close to $1 million in cash and in-kind support from all of these sources, and that was to run for about a 3-year period. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with these locations, the Valley site is in Sudbury. I'm based out of Ottawa. Sudbury is about 5 hours northwest drive of Ottawa, and then Timmins is about another 3-hour drive north of Sudbury. So the Valley site was in Sudbury. That was acidic copper-nickel tailings, like I showed you in earlier photos. The Glencore site in Onaping, just north of Sudbury, is the same type of tailings, but they covered it with desulfurized tailings. So they have a process where they take the sulfur out of the tailings, so it's less reactive at the surface, and covered their acidic tailings with, or their regular sulfur tailings with that material. So it's the same kind of thing, except one's got desulfurized tailings, the other one's got the original tailings. And then the Timmins site was an alkaline gold tailings, which had arsenic in it, so it was a different kind of case study for trying these materials. As I mentioned, we had a site at Cape Breton in Sydney at Broughton Mine on coal spoils. Unfortunately, that site was terminated because the ECBC actually, their timelines to close the site were drastically increased, and they couldn't hold the site for us for a couple of years of monitoring. We did do some work at Highland Valley Copper in British Columbia, who have been receiving Metro Vancouver biosolids for a number of years. Just a very, very difficult area to grow anything, and we didn't really make much progress there, but certainly still interested in looking at options there and elsewhere. So some of the benefits that we're looking at from this kind of a program, I mentioned dust suppression. Can be a very good growth substrate. That's something that's lacking in most of the Canadian Shield areas where the mines are found. There's not a lot of soils there that you can borrow from. We can look at decreased metal mobility, progressive reclamation, so we can close out some of these tailings areas as they fill. Generates reduced liability for it should be mining companies. We use one waste, so organic waste or organic residuals are used to reclaim another industry's waste. There's potential for carbon credits for the mining companies. There's increases in biodiversity, which is quite a big angle right now for the mining industry. Developing alternative land use, so long-term productive land use, such as bioenergy crops, and again, diverting organics. These organics, which most provinces, I guess, are moving to reduce the amount of organics in their landfills. So this offers a good diversion of those materials. Just to give you an example, the pitch we kind of made to the City of Toronto was that we could take probably between 30 and 70% of all of Southern Ontario's composted waste to cover the mines in the Sudbury area for a period of around 30 years. So it wasn't sort of a very fleeting thing here where it's only a year or two of diversion. There was potential there. If we were putting a meter cover on these tailings, there's potential for this to go on for 30 years. So it was, to me, it was quite good. Unfortunately, our timing was not good, and the City of Toronto had other plans, but I can talk about that later. So this is what, just to show you a few photos of our setup. The tailings are very, for those of you that haven't been on them, are very kind of thixanthropic. They, almost like quicksand, when you vibrate them, they liquefy. So we had trouble getting on the sites during the summer or spring or fall, particularly spring or fall when they're wet. But so what we would do is let them freeze a little bit, and then we'd actually plow the tailings, keep that snow off so that the tailings would freeze good and solid, and then we were able to run for a month or two, driving the trucks right on the tailings and dumping and spreading. So this is showing the St. Mary's material being dumped on the tailings. We used agricultural equipment to try and simulate what would happen. The whole idea at the end of the day here is that the mining companies aren't going to manage this land, that they would hire or contract or lease the land to farmers, local farmers, to be able to manage this crop production. So we engaged a local farmer who was both providing advice and his equipment to do all these trials. So this is just an example of him plowing, cultivating, and flattening out the site. That's the original test plot, one of the test plots for St. Mary's biosolids. We used 3,500 cubic meters spread over about half a hectare, so it was roughly 1 meter deep. That 1 meter depth is for two reasons. One is to try and stop oxygen from reaching the tailings so that we can stop further oxidation of those tailings, and also to give us a good depth of rooting material so that we don't have to worry so much about whether there's metal uptake issues with the tailings or from the tailings. And perhaps I'll talk a bit more about that later. Another example of the plot just seeded. We did this particular plot in canola and corn. So you're seeing corn coming up on this side. It's in quadrants, so it's corn, canola, canola, corn. So that was done at Vale. At Glencore, we didn't want to just have to deliver in, sorry, I'm just reading messages here. We didn't want to have to deliver only in the winter time, so they used Grow Bark, brought this material up in a walking bed, so the material would just, they'd back the truck up, it would vibrate and shake the material out. And then using smaller equipment, we were able to do this spreading in the winter time. It started initially putting sort of a coarse layer down first, and then coming to give us some strength or support for the equipment, and then putting in the compost material on top of that. This is not really an issue right now. As you'll see later on, Glencore is doing a lot of spreading here. They've done about 5 or 6 hectares recently with no problem in the summertime, so it's working well. So just a few photos of results here. This is the Vale site. This is where that plot went on the left-hand side. Those are the tailings. You can see the kind of vegetation that was there before in the bottom right-hand corner. And then we planted to corn and canola. And you can see we were able to grow full corn cob production. This corn was actually a hybrid developed by Agriculture Canada. It matures in 60 days because corn typically isn't grown in the Sudbury area. So it worked very well. It grew very well, went to full maturity. The problem was it was actually bred as a low sugar corn, and so it really wasn't a good candidate for us for ethanol production. But in terms of biomass, it could be used still for ethanol production. Canola, we got full seed pods. That's what you see in these photos. These are all seed pods. And in terms of a bit of data, I don't want to get too technical, but at least give you some of the numbers we came up with. This just shows biomass in tons per hectare, dry tons per hectare at the various sites along the bottom. So we typically, the best site was Vale with canola here. We got about 11 tons per hectare of biomass. In the case of Extrata, it took us a while to get that compost a bit mature, to start getting better yields. But I guess what I wanted to point out here is this number 3.3 is the tons per hectare of seed that we generated from that canola. So that was, we did based on sampling at our half-hectare test plot, and we scaled that up to 1 hectare. But we got about 3.3 tons per hectare. The seed yield in 2009, the Ontario average seed yield was 2.2. So we actually got much higher seed yield on the tailings in those biosolids than the Ontario agricultural average. So we were quite excited by that. Switchgrass is something else we were growing on there that grows about 5 or 6 feet tall. And it typically requires 3 years to establish, and our data bore that out very well. You can see 2009 we had very little growth. This is at Glencore. 2010 we started getting a little bit of growth, and then by the 3rd year we're up to 10, 11 dry tons per hectare biomass. So that's something else that could be used for either making pelletized fuel to be burned in furnaces, or even making ethanol from that. So it's another option. Corn, canola, switchgrass. We did plant some sunflowers. That was kind of an accident in some of the compost. We were having trouble establishing the switchgrass, but we had one sunflower grow in there that came in with the material. And the mining company folks like that, and so what we basically did was line the road areas with the sunflowers. As you see in the right-hand photo, this is the edge of the plot. We did try it at Vale, which is the left-hand side photo, and it grows very, very well. Whether there's a market there for it in terms of the oil and biofuel, I'm not convinced, but it's another crop option. It does, however, look very good when you're bringing people down to tour here and you bring them onto these desolate tailings, and you've got our field of sunflowers. It looks very good. So mining companies were happy with that. Willows is something else, another option we looked at. These are hybrid willows, and basically they're little plugs. In the top photo, you can see the little plugs putting in. You just plant them right side up, and you'll get the leaves growing from the top, and they'll root at the bottom. You can see them in the bottom left-hand photo. We basically plant them with, I think it was 1 meter apart in the middle, or 2 meters, and so the equipment would basically come down the center and harvest 2 rows of willows on either side at the same time. So they're planted close by on either side, and then with a larger area down the middle for the harvesting equipment. You can see that in the left side, in the right side where that space is between the middle. So we would let these grow for 1 season and then cut them to allow them to coppice, which means instead of having 1 shoot or 2 shoots, they'll now develop 3 or 4 shoots, so it greatly increases the biomass production. So this was 2011, 2012 on the right side here. And then as of about 10 days ago, this was that same plot. These willows now are growing about 20 feet tall in 3 years. That's me in the left-hand side, and that's the plot. On the right-hand side is the plot where I took that photo. So that's the tailings in the foreground, and that's our test plot. These willows are growing in about 10 to 15 centimeters of Domtar settling basin biosolids. So we tried them in both a thick cover, 1 meter of Domtar, and a thin cover at about 10 to 15 centimeters. The ones in the 10 to 15 centimeters have greatly outperformed the ones in the 1 meter. And I still don't quite understand that. When we were planting these trees, the tailings pore water was welling through it. We didn't lime this or anything. The tailings pore water coming through the biosolids, and I thought we were just sentencing all these trees to death kind of thing. Counterintuitively, they've grown very, very well in there, so we're now sort of looking more at how we can utilize thin covers of these materials rather than thick covers. So just some very rough economics. These are kind of back-of-the-envelope calculations based on the field results we got from the Green Mines Green Energy program. So if we look at the sale of, let's use canola for an example, based on the results we got, the yields we got, so say Vale, St. Mary's, canola, we generated about a little over 3,000 kilograms per hectare of seed. We would generate a net profit. So that's after subtracting, farming costs and that sort of thing, which are just, I took average numbers that I was able to obtain off the internet. So this isn't certainly any kind of certified numbers or data, but we found out you could generate about $905 per hectare of profit per year. So if you look at a site like Vale, and we did half of the Vale site, it's around 2,000 or 2,200 hectares. If we did about 1,300 hectares of that, the mining company could generate about $1.2 million per year just on the sale of the canola seed, assuming somebody's going to buy it from a mine site, which I guess is maybe another question. But based on those yields, we would be able to generate about 4.7 million liters per year of biodiesel from that canola seed if we did that whole 1,300 hectares. So we just did that to sort of show, what the potential is there. I'm not certifying these numbers, but these are sort of giving you a ballpark number of the potential. And for us, that's the selling point for the mining companies to say you can turn your tailings from a liability into something that actually generates a profit for you. And so quite excited about that. But one of the things we need to do is to put together a much stronger business case for this with real numbers and looking at various options. So I won't go through the rest of them, but you can see based on the yields we got at other sites, corn going to ethanol, we would actually lose money off that based on our yield, and then we'd get less money with canola at Goldcorp. Glencore, I think, would come along. It takes a while, because it was an immature compost, it takes a while for that to mature enough that we're getting good crop production, but probably if we were to look at that today, we'd get a much better value. But anyways, there's the rough values for what's the potential. So environmental impacts, this is just an example. People always ask us, what about the groundwater? What impact do you have on the groundwater? Well, this is an example for nickel at Vale. So Vale is a nickel mine, so there are still residual nickel values in their tailings. But I just wanted to show This is looking at groundwater data from 2008 to end of September 2011, so a 3-year period. The near surface stuff, the 1 meter wells, you can see we got an initial surge of nickel in there. You can see if you go a bit deeper, you go about a year later, we get a peak deeper down, and then about a year later than that, we get another peak at 3 meters down. And this is basically a plug of in this case, nickel contaminated water that's moving downwards through the tailings. But it's not caused, in my opinion, it's not caused, we have no evidence to show otherwise, it's not caused by the impact of the biosolids being on there, it's caused by the vibrations and the, let's say not damage, but the disturbance when applying these materials and putting the heavy equipment on there. So basically, as we vibrate these materials, they kind of liquefy, and now we've got metals dissolved in that pore water that's now moving down through the column. But after 3 years, we're basically back down to similar to what the control values are. And unfortunately, I don't have the control values on here, but we're very similar to control within 3 years. So I haven't seen any kind of an impact there. We did also do some column studies here. This was a 5-year column study here at CanMet, and this was looking at both 20-centimeter covers compared to a control, start to see here, with just tailings, compared to a 1 meter cover of biosolids, using both Vale tailings and Goldcorp tailings. So I just wanted to use this as an example of some of the negative things we did find. And this is a very busy slide, I recognize that, but this is our monitoring data from those columns for arsenic from January 2007 to about September 2010. So in this case, about a 3-year period. And basically what I want to show you is there's a blue line here, which is the control, which is just tailings. It typically runs around 1 ppm arsenic. It's higher here because we had one control column kind of go rogue, and for some reason we were getting lots of arsenic out of one column. The other one we were getting almost no arsenic out of it, and I still don't understand that. We haven't been able to figure that out. Anyway, so the control would typically run around 1. As soon as we put even 20 centimeters of biosolids on, you can see arsenic peaked right away. Within a couple of months, we had arsenic levels up to 8 or 9 ppm, but it did drop down fairly quickly after that. And then we put 1 meter cover on, it has gradually increased up to around 8 or 10, and if I had the data here updated to show you the next 2 years on this, it has continued for the full 5 years that we're now, instead of generating 1 ppm arsenic, we're releasing about 10 ppm arsenic. And so it's had a drastic effect. So that's one of the things I say at the end of this talk is tailings are not tailings are not tailings. You have to be careful what you're applying it to. Without getting too scientific, the reason for that is that the Delnite, the Goldcorp tailings, which is the Delnite site, sorry, that's a little bit confusing. The arsenic that is in there is associated with pyrite, and in this case, for the uncovered tailings, where we haven't put any biosolids on, the tailings are oxidized, and what you see around this white flake is the pyrite with arsenic attached. What you see around it is kind of a shadow, is an oxidized rim of iron. And when we put the biosolids on those tailings, we establish very strongly reducing conditions, and it basically dissolves that rim. You can see on the right-hand side, there's the pyrite with no rim around it, and now that arsenic is available for leaching, and that's what's happening. What's interesting is in the field, we're not seeing the arsenic come out because that cover is acting as a very big sponge, and while the arsenic is there, there's no rainwater flowing through that cover into the tailings and washing that arsenic out. So it's kind of an interesting thing here. We've got the arsenic available, but the cover, the biosolids cover, is actually holding the water, transpiring that back out, and we're not seeing that arsenic come out. But if we ever do have an instance where that cover is saturated and we start getting water flowing through, then we're going to see a lot of arsenic come out of that site. For this company, that was too big of a risk for them, and they're not really interested in pursuing that option, at least at this time. Metal accumulation, all this to say, we've monitored metal levels in the vegetation above ground as well as some in the roots, and looking at profiles through the covers and into the tailings. We've seen no trend whatsoever in increasing metal content in that vegetation, in any of those crops. Just to give you an idea, this is the Glencore site, so these are desulfurized tailings. So taking the sulfur out, so they're much less reactive than the Vale tailings, but you can see in the center here, even so, they're still oxidizing a little bit in areas. What you're seeing here is basically our original half-hectare plot, and then Glencore has added extra along the roadway here, and they've added this additional work that was done in around 2010, 2011. So just to give you an idea of what they've done and how they're progressing, they've adopted this idea and they want to cover this whole area with biosolids. In this case, this is the Toronto compost that's provided through GrowBark. So it's working quite well. You can see different crops here. We've got sunflowers growing in here. All the light yellow stuff is canola. Switchgrass is all in this area. So that's the initial plot plus a little bit extra. If we jump to 2014, our initial half hectare is right back in this corner. So you can now see they've done a lot of this area. They've filled in on here. They actually built a road through here to give them access onto the tailings. And now they're filling in this side. This is my marker. So if you look at this photo, because the perspective isn't the same in all these photos, unfortunately, this is my marker for how much they filled in. In this case, you can see they're starting to get close to that. And then if I look in the fall of this year, they've covered half of that. So they're slowly filling this in. Their expectations are they'll have this area filled in within 2 years, and they'll have this whole area done, which this is about 40 hectares. The whole site is about 98 hectares. They'll have that whole site covered within somewhere around 7 to 10 years. That's the plan right now. So they are making progress. So from NRCan's perspective, we started by showing the feasibility in this little test plot. The mining company is now taking this on and at their own expense are expanding this work. And I think there's lots of options for additional work in this area. One of the things that Glencore is doing now is they're working with EnviroSoil biosolids. And this is a test strip they've done where they've mixed the compost with the biosolids and actually seeded just that part. I think I have a photo of that. This is just more of a closer up of the last photo. You can see that test strip right in here. So as I mentioned, they are now looking at mixing their GrowBark materials with the EnviroSoil biosolids, which is municipal wastewater biosolids, and basically manufacturing a soil from that. And so they're looking at long-term use of those kind of materials. Other examples that have come forward. So one of the things I'm happy with this project is that I think we've made a case to regulators that they can have a lot more comfort in applying these kind of materials to these sites, arsenic aside. And historically, there's been a strong reluctance, I guess, from mining companies to use sewage biosolids because of the metal contents in there, which is kind of funny considering tailings have a lot more metals in them typically, but also the pathogens and everything else that comes along with municipal biosolids. And also with that, regulators have not been very forthcoming in allowing amendments to their certificate of approvals to apply these kind of materials. But I think as a result of this program, we're now seeing some of that stuff happen. And for example, Glencore in reclaiming, Glencore, this is in Timmins, the Kid Creek operation, where they reclaimed their jarosite pond in the top photo, actually used municipal biosolids from Toronto to amend the cover, their black muck cover. So they got approval from MOE to do that. The Kamkosha site, which I talked to earlier, is now looking at using municipal biosolids to reclaim some of these areas around the mine. And I think there's now sort of a push to where you're getting easier to get regulatory approval to use these materials. When we were in discussions with the city of Sudbury to take their leaf and yard waste compost, it was a bit of a pain to try and get MOE approvals for that because they were worried about putting these composts, which actually exceeded the metal criteria. Because Sudbury is a mineralized area. Metal levels are typically higher in there, but you're applying it to tailings where the metal levels are in some cases much higher than that. So we needed full approval from Toronto, their approvals branch in Toronto rather than the local offices. And basically Glencore decided they didn't want to go that route and decided not to use that material, which is a big waste. Now the local office, the Sudbury office of the Ministry of Environment is now doing those approvals locally. So again, I see that as a bit of an outcome of this work that regulators are now much more aware and much more open to looking at these kind of options. So I'm probably running late on time here. I'll just quickly go through some of the things we're moving forward with now at CanMet. This slide just kind of shows an overview of what we did. We started by meeting with Toronto and all these stakeholders doing the GMGE project, look at doing thick covers first, finding that's not really feasible based on the amount of material we have available and the transportation cost. Started looking at thinner covers, and that's what I mentioned with the Willows growing the thin covers. I've talked about Glencore using the compost municipal biosolids. Vale is now looking at potentially using some municipal biosolids, so there's progress being made on that front. we are now focusing mostly on biochar and other carbon amendments. Biochar, as you may know, is quite a hot item right now for agriculture and other things. So we're looking at how we can use those materials in tailings reclamation. Done a lot of work on the impact of the covers. We've done a lot of work on characterizing biochars, and biochars made from different feedstocks and different temperatures can be very, very different. And we're now moving into looking at potential uses of that biochar. I'm going to skip this slide, just more talking about from an NRCan perspective of our science policy objectives and how this all relates. But we're trying to open up a market for the biochar users to have more access to mining and how we can improve that product so that it's a better material for mining. But with both biochar and other carbon, like the organic residuals, we're looking at how we can store carbon in those tailings in the long term. The good thing with biochar is it's very recalcitrant. It won't change. It's there for a long time, and it's not going to degrade like the typical municipal biosolids or paper mill biosolids. So this is just the process. We take the dry biomass that we could grow in tailings with low oxygen and high temperature. You get three basic products: a gas, which actually fuels the system. So once you get it running, there's basically no cost to running it. It produces a low-grade oil. I think it's like a #2 fuel oil, which can be upgraded to a biodiesel. But it also produces, depending on how you make it, a 20 to 35% biochar. So that's the basis we're using that. Basically, we could grow material here and then create another material from that could go back into reclaiming the tailings so that we can grow more biomass. So trying to get that sustainable circle going. I've talked a little bit about this already. I won't dwell on that. On this work, we're working with various people like Canada, Purdue University out of Illinois, McGill University in Montreal, National Research Council, Environment Canada, as well as our sister sector here, CanmetMINING. We've got 4 different biochar producers, mostly, I think they're all in Quebec actually, plus Vale. So we're trying to do sort of multi-stakeholder type projects rather than dealing just one-on-one with an individual company. Soil amendments, I won't talk much about that, but I'll give you one example of, we're taking biochar. A lot of people say you can put biochar in agricultural soil, it's going to hold metals, it's going to retain them. We're not finding that with tailings. We're finding that biochar, depending on how you make it, has a lot of ash, which is a very high pH, so it's alkaline, and it's actually a neutralization precipitation reaction. So you raise the pH, the metals come out, and people say you're binding metals. Well, you're not really binding metals, it's just precipitating. It's not actually binding to the biochar. And so we're looking at how we can make that biochar more effective as a metal sorbent. And for example, one of the things we've tried is to use peroxide to treat that material. And this bottom graph just shows you the original material. This is copper sequestered. And this is when we've treated it with peroxide. We've gotten about a 3-fold increase in copper sorption by treating that material with peroxide. So we're looking at options similar to that. I won't talk much further on that. Characterizing biochars based on how you make them and what the feedstock is. There are materials that are much more stable compared to others. And so we're trying to get a handle on how do we make this, well, not how do we make it, but how would the manufacturers make this, and how can they tailor the process so that it's more effective for mining. One of the comments we got back from one of the manufacturers with the study that we released was it's a much needed study for all of us manufacturers. So for us, we're happy with that because it looks like we're having an impact not only on mining, but on actually a potential market, new market for this. So one of the things we did go back to was that St. Mary's biosolids plot at Vale. We looked after 6 years of what the impact was on the tailings, through core work, taking cores through the material into the tailings. Found that without liming or anything, that the carbon coming from there and the reactions that are occurring at the interface have increased the pH, reduced metal mobility. We've increased the microbial activity and the diversity of microbes in the tailings. That's what this bottom right-hand plot is showing. Controlled tailings, it's basically the number of bands is an indication of how many, the microbial diversity. So when we've got the covered tailings, we've got a lot more different organisms in there. So we're looking at doing some proof of concept work for some studies with Genome Canada. So hopefully we'll get some funding for that. So the general conclusions on this whole thing, from my standpoint, the GMGE initiative has demonstrated that it's feasible to use these materials to generate biofuel crops on tailings. There's lots of potential there to convert tailings areas from basically a liability to a profit-generating area. which in the long term can be handed over to communities once the mine actually closes. So for example, in Sudbury, if we could put, again, 1,300 hectares into biodiesel production, if the mine doesn't use that biodiesel, the city can run their bus fleets off of that. So there's potential for that to benefit the municipalities that the mines are around. And one of the obstacles we have is having sufficient volumes of these residuals and the transport costs under control that we can get them to the mine sites cheap enough. So I put that out to all of you that if you see synergies there, you know, that's a way we can try and move this forward a little bit more. I'm almost done. I'm not going to talk much about this. This is that same photo I had, same slide I had a minute ago, but just talking about we're looking now at getting into carbon and tailings. How can we quantify or augment the amount of carbon that can be stored in tailings, both through reclamation as well as you know, sort of a dedicated process to trying to put carbon into the tailings, and then how we can speed up soil development in the tailings and get those functional ecosystems or crops growing without necessarily having to put a meter of biosolids on there. Some of the considerations, I think this is my last slide or second last slide. Odor is always an issue because many of these mines are very close proximity to municipalities. You know, I get requests from a variety of different groups saying, can you use this material, can you use this material, that material. The problem is it would be better to be able somebody to collect and consolidate all of those materials and make one material out of them, i.e. sort of a manufactured soil. So I think that there's opportunity there for someone to do that. Pharmaceuticals, I think, are still an issue, something I need to be educated more on, but particularly with these municipal wastewater biosolids, it used to be metals. I think now the concern is pharmaceuticals. One of the talks I listened to at the annual meeting in Halifax for the Canadian Compost Council talked about that and saying it's very, very low risk. So that was reassuring. But I think from a mining standpoint, mining companies are still a little bit hesitant about that. Interaction with tailings, as I said, in the Vale tailings, the acidic copper nickel tailings, we didn't really see any issues with that. But if you apply it to arsenic-bearing tailings, you can have some certainly arsenic effects. And so you need to be aware of that. We need to generate more science and demonstrations across Canada. This is work all done in Ontario. It would be nice to have some sites like this in other locations. And it's critical, I think, to involve the regulators in all of these projects in terms of moving permitting forward. And that's it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Or if you want to contact me offline here, that's my email address. So thanks very much.
Hi, Bryan. Thanks so much. You know, one of the things that we have encountered year after year is that there's not sufficient, when folks want to stop us from moving organics recycling forward, they always use the word, there won't be enough markets for the end product. And so it's wonderful to hear the potential in terms of the absolute numbers. Obviously, there's barriers that need to be addressed, but to give us the opportunity and the possibility through the tremendous work that you and your team have done, it's fantastic. So thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Jolene in case there's any questions. I know we're heading close to the edge. So Jolene, could you just take over?
Yeah, so there was one question. It was asked before you kind of showed more information on the metal uptake, but it's what are the human health risks from the canola product? So like I said, it was before you had said that there wasn't metal uptake in the plants, but is this maybe something that needs to be tested further, or you kind of had alluded that maybe no one might want canola from a mine site?
Yeah, well, the work we did that showed there was no uptake was done growing in 1 meter of biosolids. So they're pretty isolated from the tailings. Now, if we're moving into 10 or 15 centimeters, where it's very likely the roots are going to be getting into the tailings and be impacted by tailings, we still need further work on that. Because tailings areas, not just tailings, but the Sudbury area, for example, it's a mineralized area. The metal levels in vegetation are typically higher regionally because of that. And that's the reason we actually stayed away from any thoughts of growing food crops on here, either for animal feed or for human consumption, both because nobody wants to eat stuff growing from a mine site, but also because we wanted to stay away from those health risks. But I think in terms of biofuel production, it's minimalized, and I think one of the issues, I've been asked the question about that, if you make biodiesel from that canola, if you've got increased metals in there, is that going to affect the process? Well, I don't really have a good answer for that. Yes, it may. I think it would be concentrated in the residual part of that after they make the biodiesel, which would basically would be looking at putting that back in the tailings as a fertilizer. So those metals that came from the tailings would basically go back to the tailings. But certainly that's an area that we still need to get further data on.
Okay. If anyone has any more questions, maybe we are just about running, or we have run out of time, but if there is one quick question, maybe we can take it. Otherwise, I'm sure this area of research definitely offers more questions as you find more answers, by the sounds of it.
Yep. Well, I'm happy. If there's no questions, I'm happy for if anybody wants to contact me. Otherwise, I'm happy to discuss anytime.
Okay. And will your presentation be available on the Compost Council of Canada website?
I think so. I'm not sure.
Okay. Excellent.
Yes, I'm sorry. It is available.
Excellent.
It should be up now at this point. Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that then, I guess I'll thank you for adding more information to the presentation in Halifax. This is very interesting, and thank you for being part of our webinar series.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm sorry that I ran a little bit long there. I would have liked to have some discussion too, but we could do that offline.
All right. Okay. Well, have a good day, everyone. Take care.